the indissolubility of marriage. The Pharisees also came to him in order to test him, saying to him, "Is it permitted for a man to divorce his wife for whatever reason?" He responded to them, "Have you not read that he who created man at the beginning created the male and female, and that he said, 'For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh'? Hence, they shall no longer be two, but one flesh only. Therefore, let no man separate what God has joined." They said to him, "But then why did Moses command that the husband give his wife a letter of separation and divorce her?" He responded to them, "It was because of the hardness of your hearts that Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. But in the beginning it was not like that. I also declare to you that he who divorces his wife, except in the case of adultery, and marries another, commits adultery, and that he who marries a wife that another divorced also commits adultery." Matt 19:3-9.
There is nothing immutable except what has come from God. Everything that is the work of humans is subject to change. The laws of nature are the same at all times and in all countries. Human laws change according to time, place, and intellectual progress. In marriage, what is of divine order is the union of the sexes to carry out the replacement of people who die. However, the conditions that govern this union are of an order that is so human that throughout the entire world, even throughout Christendom, there are no two countries where such conditions are completely the same, nor is there one where they have not undergone change over time. The result is that, in the eyes of civil law, what is legal in one country and at a given time is adulterous in another country and at a different time. This is because civil law is meant to regulate family interests, and these interests vary according to customs and local needs. Thus it is, for example, that in certain countries, only religious marriage is legal, in others a civil marriage is also required, in others, lastly, a civil marriage is enough by itself. Nevertheless, in the union of the sexes, besides the divine physical law common to all living beings, there is another divine law, as immutable as all God's laws, and exclusively moral, the law of love. God has willed for individuals to be united not only through the ties of the flesh, but also through those of the soul, so that the mutual affection of the spouses is extended to their children, and that there should be two, instead of one, to love them, care for them and enable them to progress. In the conventional conditions of marriage, is this law of love taken into consideration? Not in the least. The affection of two individuals, attracted to one another by a mutual sentiment, is not checked, and in the majority of cases this affection is shattered for the sake of other interests. 35 What is sought is not the satisfaction of the heart but the satisfaction of pride, vanity, and cupidity, in short, the satisfaction of all interests of a material nature. When everything is well according to such interests, the marriage is said to be suitable, and when the material assets are well matched, it is said that the spouses also are suited for each other and ought to be very happy. However, neither civil law nor the commitments that it contracts can replace the law of love if it does not preside over the union. The result is that what has been joined forcibly separates on its own, that the oaths sworn at the altar become perjury if they are pronounced as a banal formula. As a consequence, there are the unhappy unions that end up becoming criminal, an avoidable double disgrace if within the conditions of the marriage the only law that sanctions it in God's eyes would not be left out, the law of love. When God stated, "The two shall be one flesh only," and when Jesus says, "Do not separate what God has joined," one must understand the union according to the immutable law of God and not according to the changeable law of human beings. Is the civil law, then, superfluous, and should we return to marriages according to nature? Certainly not. The civil law is meant to regulate social relationships and family interests in accordance with the requirements of civilization. This is why it is useful and necessary, but variable. It must be provident because civilized human beings cannot live like primitives, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prevents it from being a corollary of the divine law. Obstacles to the fulfillment of the divine law arise from social prejudices, and not from the civil law. These prejudices, although still alive, have already lost much of their influence in the midst of enlightened cultures, and they will disappear altogether with moral progress, which will finally open people's eyes to the countless ills, wrongs, and crimes that result from unions entered into solely out of material interests. And someday we will ask ourselves if it is more humane, more charitable, more moral to chain to one another two individuals who cannot live together, than to restore them their freedom, or if the perspective of an indissoluble chain does not increase the number of irregular unions.
Divorce. Divorce is a human law with the purpose of legally separating what is in fact already separated. It is not contrary to God's law, since it merely reforms what humans have stipulated and is applicable only in cases in which the divine law has not been taken into account. If it were contrary to the divine law, the church itself would have to consider as transgressors those of its leaders who, by their own authority and in the name of religion, have imposed divorce on more than one occasion, a double transgression therefore, since it is practiced only with material interests in view and not to satisfy the law of love. However, Jesus himself did not consecrate the absolute indissolubility of marriage. Did he not say, "It was because of the hardness of your hearts that Moses permitted you to divorce your wives"? This means that, ever since the time of Moses, separation might become necessary when mutual affection is no longer the sole objective of marriage. Jesus adds, however, "But in the beginning it was not like that," which means that at the origin of humankind, when people were not yet perverted by selfishness and pride and lived according to God's law, unions based on reciprocal sympathy and not on vanity or ambition did not give room to divorce. Jesus goes even further and specifies the case in which divorce can have a place: adultery. Now, there is no adultery where sincere mutual affection reigns. It is true that he prohibits any man from marrying a divorced woman, but one must keep in mind the customs and character of the people in those times. In cases of adultery, the Mosaic law prescribed stoning. Wanting to abolish a barbaric custom, a penalty was needed, and Jesus found it in the disgrace attached to the prohibition of a second marriage. It was in some ways one civil law replacing another civil law, but which, like all laws of such nature, had to pass the test of time. Historical and cultural context.
In the time of Jesus, marriage was understood in a very different way than we know today. Among the Jews, it was less about personal choice and more about a family and social agreement. Marriages were arranged, often from an early age, taking into account alliances, property, and tradition. Divorce also existed, but it was allowed only for men, who could separate from their wives by giving them a letter of dismissal. This created a strong inequality. The husband had almost absolute power, while the woman was left in a position of dependence. Centuries later, in the 19th century, when Allan Kardec wrote the Gospel according to Spiritism, marriage carried both civil and religious weight. In Europe, the Church still had great influence over unions, and matrimony was seen as an indissoluble sacrament. Divorce was frowned upon, often forbidden by law, and couples were pressured to remain together even in unhappy homes. The idea of freedom of choice in marriage was starting to grow, but only in more progressive social circles. Today, however, we live in a profound transformation. Marriage is no longer a social imposition but a choice based on affection and companionship. Divorce has become legal and common in much of the world, allowing people to follow different paths when harmony no longer exists. Individual freedom has gained strength. Men and women can choose if they want to marry, with whom, or even if they prefer to remain single. This evolution shows how customs change with time, but also invites us to reflect on what remains essential: true union is not only a social contract but a spiritual bond that transcends human conventions.
Deeper spiritual reflection.
When Jesus said, "What God has joined together, let no man separate," he was not only speaking of social rules or human traditions. His message goes beyond. It refers to true spiritual unions, those born from affinity and commitments made by the soul before incarnation. Spiritism teaches us that many unions are not the result of chance. Couples may meet again on earth to fulfill missions together, repair past mistakes, or grow through the difficulties of shared life. In this sense, marriage becomes a true school for the soul, where we learn patience, tolerance, forgiveness, and selfless love. On the other hand, not all unions have divine origins. Some are born from material interests, fleeting passions, or illusions of youth. These, not being rooted in real affinity, often break apart. This is where Kardec's wisdom echoes, "What God has joined, no one can separate, but what humans have united only by convenience, God allows to be undone." In the time of Jesus and even in the 19th century, society imposed permanence in marriage even without love or respect. Today, with the freedom of divorce, many ask, are we weakening marriage? Spiritism shows us a point of balance. It is not about forcing anyone into a life of suffering, but about valuing true bonds, the ones that endure trials and difficulties. This teaching, therefore, remains current. It invites us to look beyond civil or religious contracts and to understand that true union is spiritual. Marriage, when based on sincere love and mutual respect, is a blessing and an opportunity for growth. And even when separations occur, nothing is lost. Every experience prepares us to love in a higher and more conscious way.
Complementary passages. The words of Jesus in Matthew 19, verse 6. "So they're no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate," form the foundation of this chapter. This passage reveals that true marriage goes beyond appearances. It creates a spiritual unity that cannot be broken by whims or passing interests. In the Gospel according to Spiritism, we find other valuable connections. In Chapter 4, which speaks of family ties, Kardec reminds us that the true union of souls is not of flesh, but of the spirit. This reinforces the idea that marriages based on love and affinity remain strong, while those founded only on material interest dissolve easily. In Chapter 5, on trials and expiations, we understand that many difficult unions are not punishments but opportunities for growth. A couple facing constant disagreements may be repairing past mistakes or learning lessons of patience, respect, and forgiveness. These passages expand the meaning of this chapter. They show that while we must respect today's freedom regarding marriage and divorce, we should also remember that true union does not depend on human laws, but on divine law engraved in the heart. Practical application for the viewer. This chapter teaches us that marriage and true unions are not just social commitments, but opportunities for spiritual growth. And this reflection can be applied in several ways in daily life. Value dialogue and respect. Every relationship faces difficult moments. Honest dialogue, combined with respect, is what keeps a union strong. Running away from problems doesn't solve them. Learning to face them together does. Practice patience and tolerance. Living together often reveals differences in personality, habits, and opinions. These differences are not obstacles, but invitations to inner growth. Every disagreement is a chance to exercise understanding. Look beyond appearances. Before judging a relationship only by its outward form, remember that there are invisible spiritual bonds that unite people. Some couples stay together for decades not because they never had challenges, but because of the strength of this deeper connection. Respect freedom and choices. Not every union lasts forever. When love and respect no longer exist, Separation may be a necessary path. Divorce should not be seen only as failure, but as the closing of a cycle of learning. Transform a home into a space of spiritual growth. More than just living under the same roof, the real challenge is to turn the home into a place of peace, support, faith, and harmony. Every act of kindness, every word of encouragement strengthens the invisible bonds that truly sustain a union. In summary, this teaching invites us to look at relationships with more spirituality and less superficiality. The true value of marriage lies in learning to love in a purer and more conscious way, and this lesson is available to everyone, whether married, single, or separated.